the Hague Initiative for International
A
Cooperation.
very important
From the Israel Institute of New Zealand.
My roots come from Jerusalem.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Ashley Church from the Israel Institute of New Zealand. I'm here with Dr. David Cumin, and this is the Israel Report. And David, interesting news in the last few days about a reversal of policy by Airbnb with respect to its operation in Israel. Give us a little bit of background about that.
Yeah, that's right. A little while ago, Airbnb decided that they weren't going to allow Jewish businesses on their site who had homes in Judea and Samaria or the West Bank. It's a little bit disappointing that that decision was also supported by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, who traditionally have spoken up for human rights.
Right.
But Airbnb has recently said that they will now allow Jewish homes back on their site and that they are not discriminatory and they do not support the BDS campaign, the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign that delegitimizes Israel and demonizes Israel and really is discriminatory. So Airbnb have taken a massive step, and it comes on the back of a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit that was brought by Shurat haDin, the Israeli Law Centre.
Now, this is the same law centre in Israel that was also involved in fact, instigated a lawsuit against Iran and Syria for being complicit in materially being involved with Hamas in an incident which caused the death of a 3-year-old child.
Yeah, that's right, 2014 attack. And they won the case in 2017 and got more than $170 million out of Iran and Syria. And this is also the organisation that has won or had assets frozen up to almost $3 billion over time.
Tell me a bit more about this law centre, because they obviously sound like they're fairly effective at what they do. Those aren't the only two lawsuits, as I understand it.
Oh no, there are plenty, and up to $3 billion means there's a lot of work that's gone in.
Right.
They go after mainly terror organisations against Israelis. But it's interesting, that case that you mentioned about Iran and Syria, because the United States has recently designated the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terror organisation. And so this is further evidence of that, and a really important step, I think, in standing up to global terror.
Interestingly, talking about changes of policy, and with regard to the Trump administration, they've also just recently made a change of policy with regard to their view of the Israeli control or sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which is a change in, I think, a 70-year long standing policy with regard to, well, not 70 years, but for a long period of time, with regard to the ownership, the sovereignty over that piece of land. So give us a little bit of a background to that.
Yeah, well, in 1967, the Arab nations declared war on Israel and started an offensive war, and out of that, Israel acquired territory, including the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza, West Bank and the Golan Heights. And
their sovereignty over that land has never been accepted?
No, not really. Not by the international community. And the United States decision is really recognising reality, recognising what's important for peace and security. And the United Nations resolutions that have mentioned Golan, and there are a couple that come up every year, are going to be interesting to watch. Would it
be your expectation, given that change of policy by the Trump administration, in the same way that the change of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem has now been followed by other nations, that the same thing will happen with respect of the sovereignty of the Golan Heights by Israel? Other nations will follow suit and do the same thing?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I think it's both Jerusalem and the Golan Heights recognition are totally within international law. They are good for peace and security on the whole, and the United States is leading this, and I certainly hope that other nations follow. And I'm a little bit ashamed that New Zealand hasn't decided to follow in the acknowledgement of West Jerusalem, at least as the capital of Israel.
And you mentioned the UN. What do you expect their attitude toward this to be?
Well, the United Nations, as we know, is not made up of wholly democratic countries.
Not normally friendly to Israel under general circumstances?
Certainly not. And you've done an excellent video on that, outlining a number of the concerns, and we should have a look at that now.
Few of the attacks on Israel are more effective than the claim that even the United Nations condemns Israel. And it does. In any given year, the UN General Assembly passes more than 3 times as many resolutions condemning Israel than those condemning all of the other 192 states combined. Not to mention a myriad of other UN groups that regularly pass judgment on this tiny nation. So, despite the atrocious actions of the many tyrants, despots and failed nation states in the world, Israel is apparently so bad that its actions deserve the overwhelming attention and chastisement of the United Nations. Clearly this isn't the case, and the anti-Israel resolutions themselves deserve closer examination. They're actually the same resolutions every year, rolled out annually as part of a much larger anti-Israel strategy which has been underway for decades and which seeks to minimise the Jewish connection to Israel, despite the overwhelming evidence of archaeology, genetic testing and historical records. So how do the promoters of these resolutions gain support year on year? Easily. There are 120 member nations of the non-aligned movement, including the 57 member states of the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation. These countries are almost all inherently anti-democratic and share an animosity to Western values in general and to Israel in particular. Given that there are only 193 member states in the UN, this means that anti-Israel resolutions are almost always guaranteed majority support. It's simple math. But that isn't the only way in which the UN's biased toward Israel. In 1948, following Israel's defensive war of independence, approximately 750,000 Arabs and even more Jews were left homeless. To address this problem, the UN set up a special agency known as the Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA. There was no need for a similar agency for Jewish refugees from Arab nations because Israel immediately accepted these people and made them citizens. UNRWA was meant to be a temporary service, but has continued and now also counts the descendants of the original Palestinian refugees as refugees themselves, a group they now claim to number more than 5 million people. UNRWA has an annual budget which works out to approximately $260 per person per year, and in contrast, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which caters for all other refugees in the world, provides similar services for approximately $85 per person per year. So there are regular claims of inefficiency and corruption levelled against UNRWA as a result of this. But what's more worrisome is that UNRWA operates in a way which actually perpetuates the Arab-Israeli conflict. Unlike the UN Commission for Refugees, which helps settle thousands of refugees each year, UNRWA actively opposes resettlement of Arab Palestinians. Instead, it promotes a so-called right of return, meaning that every Arab Palestinian who left his or her home in 1948 and their descendants should have the right to return and take over property. Such a claim has no legal precedent and has not been applied in any other cases of wartime refugees throughout the 20th century. UNRWA school textbooks perpetuate this right of return as a political tool against Israel. Worse still, textbooks have been found to refer to Jews as greedy and oppressive. They also represent Jewish holy sites as Muslim holy places usurped by the Jews, and they don't recognise Israel as a sovereign state, nor show it on maps. The list goes on. Entries to terrorist tunnels have been discovered in UNRWA facilities. UNRWA schools have been used to store missiles. And in 2015, UN Watch released a report documenting UNRWA staff posting anti-Semitic material and supporting terrorism on social media. For these reasons, the US recently withheld funding to UNRWA, and Switzerland's foreign minister said UNRWA is part of the problem and keeps the Israeli-Palestinian conflict alive. But many other nations that claim to stand for peace are yet to even acknowledge the flaws and continue to fund this corrupt agency. Sadly, the United Nations has fallen far from its lofty aspirations. Its anti-Israel resolutions, its selective revisions of history, and the unacceptable activities of its agencies all send a clear signal to Palestinian leaders that they don't need to negotiate because the so-called international community will force Israel to submit. Rather than being complicit in this UN bias, it's time for democratic nations to review their principles, call out the UN for this bias, and say enough is enough.
Hague Initiative for International Cooperation.
A very important word.
Almost every language from the Israel Institute of New Zealand.
My roots come from Jerusalem.